All right. Awesome. Good evening and welcome to our mini seminar in our limited series, Climate Conscious NC. My name is Max Colley. I'm Program Manager for Learning Philosophy and Evaluation at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina, and I'll be moderating this important discussion this evening. Tonight, our panelists, who will introduce themselves in just a moment, will be discussing the science and lived experience of extreme precipitation events here in North Carolina, which we know impact both rural and urban areas and the people who live in them differently. Before we get to that discussion, I want to take a moment to thank our partners without whom this would not have been possible. Those partners include the Ellerby Creek Watershed Association, SciStarter, the Museum of Science in Boston, Durham County Sustainability Office, IC Change, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, the Climate Change and Society Program at NC State, and the North Carolina Climate Office. I also want to note that this resource was prepared by supportive award NA 18SEC0080008 from the Environmental Literacy Program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which is the US Department of Commerce. The findings, statements, conclusions, and recommendations are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of NOAA or the US Department of Commerce. Climate Conscious NC is a 6-part series, of which tonight is the very first piece. Over the next few weeks, we're going to continue this series, starting next week with a public forum about building resilience here in North Carolina. That's at 6:30 on September the 10th, so next Thursday. There you'll have an opportunity to reflect on your own values and perspectives with regards to resilience and adaptation strategy here in North Carolina. Those conversations may sound very similar to the conversation that you're going to hear tonight from our illustrious panel. We have a whole lot to consider and not as much time as we'd like. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our illustrious panel to introduce themselves. And I'll start with our moderator for this evening, Aranza Sue.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I work at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. It's a center located at North Carolina State University, and it's funded by the USGS, and we look at climate impacts to ecosystems, natural and cultural resources, and how to co-produce the data information needed for climate adaptation. Let's go to Diego.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Diego Rivero Sidegui. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography at UNC Chapel Hill. I've been in the Department of Geography for about 7 years. I am a hydrologist by training. I worked on places like the Rocky Mountains. I work on the Andes Mountains of South America. And here in North Carolina, I work around Chapel Hill and the coastal plain, looking at issues of precipitation and water quality. What is in the water, what kind of pollutants we find in the water, and where are those pollutants coming from? Thank you.
Jared, let's go to you.
Sure. I'm Jared Bowden. I'm a senior research scholar at NC State University. I work in the Department of Applied Ecology. I'm an applied climatologist that tries to bridge the science of climate and climate change and variability in the climate system with various problems for stakeholders across the state as well as other parts of the world. So my main thing is I try to really understand, how does precipitation intensity, how is it changing, and how will it evolve in a warmer climate?
Thank you. Louis?
Hi, I'm Louis Rivers. I am an associate professor at North Carolina State University in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources, and I am a social scientist. So I focus on how do these changes in climate impact human populations, and I really focus on vulnerable populations and underserved populations when we think about these issues.
Thank you. Amber.
Hi, Amber Weaver with the City of Asheville's Office of Sustainability. We dip our fingers in several different areas, but mainly our team focuses on climate mitigation and climate resiliency. for the organization as well as our community members at large.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Excellent. Well, let's get going. I'm so excited about having you all on the panel this evening. And I think we had a really momentous occasion for this talk because we had what I think was a heavy precipitation event on Monday night. So maybe to help us sort of frame what that means, I wanted to ask you, so we might broadly understand that sometimes it rains or snows a lot, but it can be harder really to understand what the difference is between what we typically think of as a rainy day and what an extreme precipitation event looks and feels like. So what does an extreme precipitation event look or feel like to you and the communities you serve? And I'll start with Jared to help us kind of think about what it means to have a heavy precipitation event.
Right. Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, people define these things very differently between different communities. An engineer defines an extreme event based on probability statistics and return periods, like a 1 in 500-year storm, where a meteorologist or an atmospheric scientist may think about it as like, oh, this exceeds a certain percentile or a certain threshold, like 3 inches in a day. So it really all depends. And the thing is how does it affect the people in Eastern North Carolina? And so I'm from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and my first experience were actually Hurricane Floyd back in 1999, and the extensive flooding that we saw in Rocky Mount. Actually, I just walked right outside my house and walked down the street, and it's like, whoa, what happened overnight? You know, you were thinking, I'd never seen anything like this. And back then I said, well, probably never see anything like this again in my lifetime. And we've seen it twice now. And so, you know, these types of storms are, you know, impacting our infrastructure. Our infrastructure is aging. And so there's definitely a think about resilience, and how do we think about, you know, being more resilient to flooding, and how do we protect the people and the resources we have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And Diego, would you like to add something from your perspective?
Yes. So in my class, I always talk to students about the amount of rainfall we receive in Chapel Hill or in North Carolina, and areas that they're very familiar with. So we say, okay, so North Carolina or Chapel Hill receives somewhere in the order of 46 inches of rain a year, 48. If you have an event that is dropping 10 inches over 24 hours, that can be considered an extreme event, right? And we also know that those 46, 48 inches are distributed almost equally throughout the year. Perhaps late summer we see more rainfall and whatnot, but to have an event that really brings so much rain very quickly, that's a problem. And the other problem that we have to think about is all that water has to go somewhere, and our geography and our physiography doesn't really allow it. We are in the Piedmont, and sure, water is going to run and flow downhill to an extent, but close to us is the coastal plain. So then really it becomes a routing problem. So there's a lot of ponding, there's a lot of flooding that can happen. So these contribute to the problem of the extreme event itself.
That's right. Yeah,
And
please,
to
Louis.
pick up on what Diego was saying, these extreme events are experienced differently depending on your local, like hyper-local geography. So like, if you're at the top of the watershed, if you're in a higher part of a watershed, this is just like, you know, my kids can't play outside, which in these days and times is like a serious issue, but you know, it'll be okay. But like, if you're at the bottom of a watershed, which with some of the communities I work with, then this can be a pretty major event for you. You know, you may be flooded, there may be damage to your local house, your yard may be wet for most of the year. So I think our experience of these events are not equal.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to add on to Louis' conversation about experience and how communities and community members experience flooding and climate change. So here in Asheville, what we have tend to find through our studies on exploring flooding events is that they are definitely in our BIPOC frontline communities. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it's Black, Indigenous people of color. And what is even more fascinating is that while this year or this year we're working on mapping exactly mapping red line communities and overlapping that with our climate threats, which really tells the story that Louis was talking about, that our low income communities of color are most greatly affected. And why would that be, you might think? Well, of course, during redlining, people of color and the communities that they created were destroyed, and they were moved and pushed out into more undesirable areas in Asheville. Those undesirable areas are those that are more inclined to flooding. And so obviously that is a factor that we're finding. And then simple things like, is it flooding and you can't, our transit buses aren't working, so our transit buses aren't getting to people and they're unable to actually leave their communities. And so we're continuing to kind of explore those effects, and we're also working with an equity consultant to be going into these communities and asking them to help us tell the story so we can better understand as practitioners of government to make changes that are actually beneficial for our BIPOC frontline community members.
So I'll follow up on Amber. So one of the things that it kind of follows up to thinking about, well, how does this impact me? And so you can imagine, well, maybe your house didn't necessarily get flooded, but the transportation infrastructure can be significantly impacted. And so that's been a serious problem in Eastern North Carolina, and especially for emergency responders. So how do they get to you? If you have an emergency at your house and the road's flooded down the street, how do they get to you in a timely manner to take you somewhere to get you treated, for instance? And so these are serious problems that we have to think about and address, and how do we handle that in the future and make our systems, especially our transportation systems, for instance, more resilient.
Yeah, it seems that so many factors and institutions and professions come into play with dealing with these events, right? I mean, you've got transportation, you've got infrastructure, you've got communities. And so I'm just wondering about, the kind of coordination we need more and more, going forward, right? We know that in, the National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018 and the North Carolina Climate Report, we're seeing more and more of these 3-inch plus events, more than we've seen in the previous part of the 20th century. And so do you have some thoughts, all of you, about sort of what adaptive capacities we need to be thinking about for these events?
Hey, I'll get started, but not to put Amber on the spot, but I'd be interested to hear her response. One of the, I'll talk about challenges that our ecosystems don't obey our jurisdictional boundaries. So, so I work a lot in the Raleigh-Durham area, specifically in the Walnut Creek watershed, which has Cary and Raleigh in it. And, they work together, but those are two different jurisdictions, even though this watershed goes across those two jurisdictions. So there needs to be more coordination at a local level across these jurisdictional agencies, but it's difficult. So I think a lot of the people that work in government are cognizant of these issues, but they're kind of bound by what they can do due to the jurisdictions that they work in and how we've kind of divided power here in the States.
No, that's a really great question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's jurisdictional boundaries, but nature doesn't see that, right? And so I think what we're doing as a team, and internal, the office, as well as my counterparts across North Carolina. So that includes, Emily and Cary and Tobin and Durham. We're working with the state as well. So the Executive Order 80 Clean Energy Plan also has a component of resiliency. And I think that was great that they included that, because many jurisdictions, I should say, had already teamed up with NEMAC to kind of identify these climate threats. And I think it just helped the state with the information that they're gathering. I'm hoping what we'll see in the future is a continued state-led efforts on how they would like for the state of North Carolina to address these large rain events. And in addition to that, our local land to sky, which is a COG, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm new to North Carolina, so if somebody can step in with that acronym, I'm blanking, of course, in this moment. So Council of Government, excuse me. So our local Council of Government is also looking at like a regional plan on how we might want to address some of these climate threats that they're aware of. And they're working with UNCA's NEMAC, National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, to identify what those climate threats are regionally and how we might want to address them regionally. One specific example is around supply chain, right? Supply chain, also something that just doesn't stay in one spot. But, if something's happening in Eastern North Carolina and the supplies can't get to Western North Carolina due to a climate threat, that's a real issue. Here in Asheville, there's really only 2 major interstates to get into Western Carolina. So I'm very pleased that the governor has identified climate resilience as something that we as a state need to be working on.
And I wanted to bring up the issue that the principal topic is discussing among rural and urban communities. And so I wanted to have maybe Jared or Diego chime in regarding, what does this mean for rural parts of our state? We're a very dominant agricultural state as well, and we have a lot of farming communities and also vulnerable communities in the rural parts of the state. So, when we have these heavy precipitation events, it affects soils and it affects other issues, our food systems. What does this mean for our rural areas of the state?
I'll let Diego take this one.
Okay.
Especially from a water quality perspective, I think that'd be interesting to hear.
Okay, yeah, so I've had the opportunity to work with folks at NC State and in a couple of projects looking at water quality after Hurricane Matthew and after Hurricane Florence in Eastern North Carolina, in areas with very high density of confined animal feeding operations. So, and looking at what is in the water and where do these pollutants go with flooding. And some of the issues that exist are what we call the connectivity of the surface waters with other waters, the connectivity of potential like waste lagoons with surface waters, and potentially with groundwaters as well. And with regards to the communities, well, many of these communities are tapping into the groundwaters for their drinking water. So, but this is an area we look at the chemistry, we look at what can be in the water, and we try to estimate what the residence time of some of these pollutants can be. But the other challenge that we have is that we're also dealing with an enormous amount of of chemicals that can make it in the water. So we've conducted some of those surveys. We worked with the community, communicating our science with them, and try to get to these assessments, and conducted these surveys post extreme events.
Yeah, I'll follow up. I'm working with some coastal communities and on-site wastewater treatment, and groundwater levels are rising in the eastern part of the state. And so one thing is if you have a septic system in your backyard or something, you need dry soil. And if the groundwater tables are rising, it threatens the efficiency or the effectiveness of the septic system. And so, you know, it may be in your own backyard that you notice, oh, things are ponding up and then it smells funny and things like that. Well, your septic system isn't operating as expected. And it could be that one of the things is you're at threat to both thinking about extreme precipitation and groundwater level rise, but also maybe sea level rise is influencing that as well.
That's right. And I'm thinking about the communities, the lived experience of communities in our rural parts of the state, you know, the Lumbee tribal community. We've also got African-American communities that really want to stay where they are because they've had a long cultural and history there. And so maybe, Louis, can you tell us a little bit about what this means for those communities that have this deep shared history of place? And then we've got these really dramatic couplings of, you know, hurricanes, plus then these, you know, heavy precipitation events.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on some of the stuff Jared's been pointing at, intercoastal eastern North Carolina is under serious pressure right now in terms of like water and change of climate. So I think a lot of times when we think of climate migrants, we want to think about countries in Africa or maybe countries in South America, but we will shortly have climate migrants in the state of North Carolina. And, you know, and to me, the question is, what is our responsibility to these communities that really kind of are experiencing the immediate ramifications of, like, you know, a process that we've all taken part in and benefited from, you know, fossil fuels. So I think it's difficult. These communities are in a position where they may not be able to stay where they are, and mitigation may not be possible. So like, I think at this point we need to be thinking about how can we help these communities transition, or how can we help maintain where they are? And that's a question of infrastructure, you know, and developing the infrastructure in that part of the state. And that's tightly linked to the economy. I think Eastern North Carolina has been overlooked for a large part of like the state's history. People just kind of go through it, going to the Outer Banks. So I think there's a lot, I think we really need to think about what are we gonna do for those communities?
That's exactly right. Well, we have just a few more minutes, and I wanted to maybe go around the panel and see if there's any remaining thoughts that you have that really calls us to action with respect to your research and what you do, and that I can help you personally with, or have our community know the action tasks ahead.
I'll go ahead and get started. That went by quick. Wow, Max, you were right. I'll be quick. To people listening, you matter a lot. Like your local vote, what you do, it matters tremendously for this issue, because so much of the development issues, which, you know, how we decide to develop our communities, what we decide to build, those are hyper local issues, and you have a tremendous impact on how those issues go. So like, you know, it may sound corny, but get involved in your local governance, because it's super important, and like you can directly influence how we think about these issues.
I'll follow up with what Louis is saying here. I think community involvement is very important. In particular, rainfall is very discrete in space and time. And so what happened in my backyard didn't happen in your backyard. And that, you know, we see that all the time. And so one thing that I think is the really good community science project program is the COCO ROS, which is a network where you can actually go out and put a rain gauge if you have the space. Diego, we may not in our community, right? But it depends on where you live. If you have the good place, a good location to put it, and then be able to be an observer, because you think, oh, this data might not get used. Actually, this data is very important. For instance, if you're a Cocoa Robs observer, NOAA, they develop these atlases that engineers use for design. And they take this Cocoa Robs data into consideration in developing those design curves, for instance, for engineers. So if they're going to go size a culvert out there and they're going to update the atlas, they might be using your data. So I really think it's a great idea for the community to think about getting involved, for instance, with Cocoa Robs.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. How about you, Amber?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question, and I'm so glad to hear our panelists talk about local initiatives and easy things you can do, like vote. And one of the things that we're doing here in Asheville is when you think about climate change and you think about flooding and resiliency and how to be a more resilient Asheville, I am asking people to think about, well, what can you do just on your own property, right? And that's not to say everyone is a property owner by any means, but whether you're renting property or you own property, if you could make just a few adjustments and low cost adjustments, best management practices that address some of these climate threats, planting a tree, planting ground cover, planting drought plants. If you can contribute just a little bit, then collectively we will become a more resilient Asheville. And I believe that that is the same philosophy for us as a state. If we start small, and if everybody can take on a task or two, then collectively we will be able to become a more resilient North Carolina and nation.
Thank you, Amber. Diego.
And I'll just follow up on something that Jared said earlier with regards to groundwater. So North Carolina is one of the top states in the country, and I want to say one of the top 3 states in the country in number of private groundwater wells. Mm-hmm. And those groundwater wells are exempt from the Safe Water Drinking Act. So people are responsible for monitoring the quality of their water. Mm-hmm. So if you are on a well, check the water quality often. So especially with regards to the point that Jared was making, flooding, water tables rising, and well, you want to check the water.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, everyone. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your expertise and your points of view. I really appreciate it.
Aranzasu, do you want to give your final thoughts about the conversation too?
Yeah, I mean, it just really hit home for me this Monday. I mean, we had a torrent of water coming through my daughter's bedroom window. And it's interesting, it made our whole kind of corner of the block have a conversation we've never had before on rain, on heavy rain. And, you know, it just made me think, you know, well, is the city prepared for more of these events? And how will they be prepared to help communities address this excess water, right? It's not just about sort of we're growing as a city, yes, but then we're also having a lot more water in this world of impervious surfaces. So yeah, it just hit me very personally, and it allowed me the opportunity to have a conversation with my neighbors.
That's great. And I'm so glad to end this conversation on that note, because that is one of the central goals of this particular project, is that a core piece of building a resilient North Carolina is connecting more with your neighbors about this hazard in particular, but about climate change more generally. One of the central goals of this project, which you'll continue to learn about, is getting you more involved, not only just in talking about climate change, but also continuing to follow and follow the advice of this conversation that we just heard tonight, and become more involved in projects like Jared pointed out, like CocoRAS. You can find more information like that through Museum of Life and Science's SciStarter page at scistarter.org/NOAA-Life and Science, and get involved in that project and others related to extreme precipitation events like we've talked about tonight, and other events as well. Like I said at the beginning of the conversation, next week we'll be talking, you'll be talking actually in our public forum event, which will happen virtually next Thursday from 6:30 to 7:30. And we will, of course, be talking about extreme precipitation resilience there as well. So I hope to see you all there. I want to take a moment to thank all of our extremely wonderful panelists. Thank you all so much for spending this evening with us. And thank you all to all of y'all that are watching and listening from home as well. I hope you all have a great rest of your night. Thanks so much.